So we left off talking about common grace versus saving grace. And a lot of the conversation involved, at least particularly with the common graces, that with the unbeliever. And so when we look at common grace and how that's present in the world, it's really important to get a perspective on the world, especially culture. So we're going to be looking at that a little bit today. So there are various realms to when we approach culture that you have to consider. The first is obviously culture is going to include artifacts, collective actions, beliefs, practices. They're all sustained by certain institutions, and so you can have a broader culture, and then within a broad culture, you can have subcultures. And we see this in the United States. For example, there's Western culture. All right, so when I say Western culture, you may think of, okay, well, we have internet, we don't have as much poverty as the majority of the world, all of those things. But when you look at Western culture, you can break it up even further. For example, culture in the South has a lot of variances from that in the North. For example, whenever it comes to mannerisms, the way you speak, your priorities, they're going to differ. And so there are those areas that you're going to have to consider whenever you look at the world. And culture is a huge proponent of whenever you consider people as individuals and as groups, especially in how God interacts with the world. Because remember, culture is a direct result of the creation mandate. So culture in and of itself is not bad. We were called to create culture. And so, but as we've discussed in the last unit, or discussed previously, is that culture, because it's created by fallen individuals, can reflect that fallenness. And so keep in mind that whenever we talk about beliefs and practices, that yes, it is a product of being made in the image of God and is good. It's part of fulfilling the creation mandate. But at the same time is that it's also, cultures are also going to produce some things that are not necessarily in accordance with God's will because of fallen humanity. All right, so there are different types of culture. There's folk culture, there's high culture, and then there's pop culture. Your folk culture emerges organically through the natural creativity of people in a particular region. For example, the type of music, if you will. For example, like you have Mongolian throat singing and whatnot. That's part of folk culture. Why? Because it's evident of creativity, and it's from a particular region. We don't really do Mongolian throat singing here in our culture. So that is folk culture. Then you have high culture. This results from centuries of refinement, and it's this idea of evolving towards excellence. And so recent high culture would also include a lot of modern and postmodern thoughts. And this in and of itself can be very self-destructive, just because the very idea of excellence in and of itself can really consume a person at an individual level, but also a culture. So it kind of can end up being self-defeating. So typically, though, interestingly enough, this is actually more in line with biblical values. And so this idea of excelling, of progressing, of developing. And so obviously, guys, you can see that whenever you think of biblical values, that we're supposed to grow towards righteousness, and we're supposed to become more refined, submit our every thought to Christ. But it's also important for you to understand is that just as values are obviously evident whenever it comes to our relationship with Christ, that culture in and of itself, even though it may have values, it can really be self-defeating. All right, last is pop culture. This is probably one of the most familiar types of culture that you have. that you've probably seen more of, and this basically refers to the broader culture, consumer culture, or mass culture. And basically, if the media says it's in, then it's in, and that's kind of a form of pop culture. This is aimed at diversion. It's shaped by the latest fad. For example, Crocs being in again is a fad, and that's a result of pop culture. And a lot of times, guys, this is going to be targeted towards your age group, just because in your age group there's this big group think mentality. And so if the group accepts it, that makes it popular, hence popular culture. And this can be extremely dangerous because it can definitely become a form of worship where, hey, I have to have that latest fad, I have to have that latest product, and if I don't have it, then my life is meaningless. And so that would kind of be a medium of worship. All right, so in looking at cultural sensibilities, when evaluating culture, most people evaluate only content without evaluating how their own sensibilities are being shaped. So basically, guys, what we like to do is we like to evaluate, but without that applicational part where we take a step back and really look and see, okay, how has culture shaped myself? So you don't think about how you have been impacted. Instead, we're like, oh, well, we just think about the content. We know this, but we fail to do that real analysis of, all right, well, how do I personally interact with culture, and how has that shaped me? And that's really important for you as a Christian to understand, is that if there are good parts and bad parts to culture, what are those good and bad parts that I have in my own life? How have I personally been shaped? All right, so that's something that you need to consider. All right, so popular culture encourages a mood of expecting everything to be immediate. All right, it's a mood that deters greater depth and breadth in other areas of our lives, including our understanding of Christianity and our experience to obedient faith. That is something that, if you really think about Western culture, it's a huge thing. We want things immediately. We want that instant gratification, and we want it now, and we want that to be excellent. And that's in every single area of our lives. Now think about that type of mentality and apply that to your relationship with God. All right, that I have to be perfect, I have to do this, and I have to be excellent, and I need to have everything immediately. That can be a real dangerous mentality to have and to bring into your own Christian faith. All right, folk culture disdains the formal, educated analysis. Now, there's a lot of reasons for that. Sometimes with your folk culture, guys, it can just be that they're not used to a certain line of thought, or it could be a form of prejudice where it's, hey, we have our own culture and we don't need this higher culture or pop culture to tell us otherwise. And then you have higher culture, which disdains the common or the unrefined, which stereotypically you could think of with the folk culture. All right, and we'll pick up here in the next video.